The European Space Agency ESA has just certified that an astronaut with a leg prosthetic is certified to fly to the International Space Station on a long-term mission. But the test that they did should not have taken 2 years. They are going painfully slow, but at least they're doing something, which most space agencies are not. However, I do want to talk about the fact that there are other options coming online for people with disabilities as governments fail to make spaceflight as accessible as it could and should be. There was a press briefing that ESA held on Friday. It went really under the radar. I only heard about it today. There were very few articles that came from this, very little information that came from the fact that John McFall, who was selected 2 years ago to be the first para-astronaut, which is a terrible name, but he was selected as ESA's first astronaut with a disability. He is now certified to fly to the International Space Station. It does not mean that he actually has a flight. He may never fly to ISS, but at least right now he is certified. Why this study took almost 2 years, I have no idea, because really this could have been accomplished in weeks, just based on the information we have, which is not very much. This is called the Fly Feasibility Study. And what they were doing was taking an astronaut with a specific type of disability. In this case, John McFall has an amputated leg and a leg prosthesis. And they were seeing whether or not a person with this type of disability is qualified to be a full member of the crew of the International Space Station for a 6-month mission. John McFall was selected as an ESA reserve astronaut back in November 2022. I will link his bio below. He is a phenomenal astronaut candidate. His accomplishments are significantly impressive, as government astronauts tend to be. And so he is extremely qualified to be an astronaut. When ESA was looking at its para-astronaut program, they specifically were looking for only a very subsection of people with disabilities. They were looking at people with leg amputations, shortened stature. Like, they had very, very, very specific requirements of who they were looking for to start with. And even the PI, the head of the Fly Feasibility Study, he even said that this was just one step at a time, starting somewhere. And I do give ESA credit for starting somewhere. NASA does not have an equivalent program. No other space agency that I know of has an equivalent program. With the sheer number of people that apply to be a NASA astronaut, they need to get rid of most of their candidates. They need to really narrow it down. And so they do not, at this time, NASA does not have a means of studying whether or not someone with a disability can fly into space. But I will get into the fact that NASA has actually flown people with prostheses and other health conditions, but they just don't talk about it. I'll get into that later. The head of ESA's Fly Feasibility Study did say this on Friday. He said, "At this stage, we have not identified any technical obstacles that would hinder the possibility of John McFall carrying out a long-term mission, 6 months, on the International Space Station as a full-time crew member." And John McFall was able to say that it might not even be him who becomes that full-time crew member. It might be someone with his same disability who becomes a crew member, which would be a real shame, actually, if he did not get a chance to fly. So what took 2 years? I have no idea. There's very little information about what they actually did that took so long to test. We do have some information about what they were looking for. They were testing his ability to emergency evacuate the spacecraft heading to the International Space Station. And so most likelihood that spacecraft would be a Dragon. It could be a Soyuz. It could be a Boeing Starliner. Some vehicle that is able to take astronauts to the ISS. They were testing whether or not John McFall could safely evacuate. And this was actually the number one concern when I began talking to people a few years ago about why government agencies aren't more open to astronauts with disabilities. And emergency situations was the number one topic that came up. Can these astronauts become full crew members and not be a liability during emergency egress, during any kind of emergency situation? It's funny how we figure out these accommodations and things that can be done to help people with disabilities on the ground here on Earth, but yet when it comes to space, people just tend to be really close-minded about what's possible. So John said on this briefing on Friday, I had to wear my prosthetic during the launch inside my spacesuit. Now, this was of course a simulated launch, so they might have used a centrifuge, although they didn't say that. I've done a tiny bit of astronaut training through the NASTAR Center outside of Philadelphia, and what we did to simulate launch was we were in a centrifuge. We didn't wear a full spacesuit in the centrifuge, so it sounds like maybe he was doing that. I'm just speculating here. I don't have all the full information. They did not release a lot of information. They also tested whether John can use the exercise equipment on the International Space Station. There's a specific treadmill, for example, specific exercise bike. Again, why that took almost 2 years. I have no idea, since that equipment is very readily available here on Earth at Johnson Space Center. I'm sure equivalents in Europe. I was able to find a PowerPoint presentation which describes a little bit about what the fly feasibility study was looking for. Just to give you some examples, they were looking at ability to perform manual tasks, repair and maintenance, experiment setup, ability to communicate verbally, receive verbal commands, ability to see, procedures, labels, indicators, availability to implement emergency procedures, autonomy to move or stand. So you can see from that list that they are looking at a very small sliver of disabilities. They are not looking at, people who are blind and can't see, or people who can't communicate verbally. Like, they're not looking for inclusivity in this study. They're looking to see if a specific person with a specific type of disability can perform these tasks. That PowerPoint presentation was put together before John McFall was selected, so I was unable to find information about his specific training and his specific testing, but presumably he went through the testing that they had set out and passed all of these different criteria. And I admit to being super frustrated that this is taking so long. Government astronauts generally do take a long time to go from selection to flying. However, in this case, he doesn't even know if he's going to get the chance to fly or not. He's not manifested on a crew. And I can't help but think that if this was the commercial industry, things would have gone a lot faster. Because when money is involved, when real money from a paying customer is involved, things go quickly. Service providers make things happen. So a private spaceflight provider will make it happen if it's safe to fly somebody, a customer with a disability. For example, Haley Arsenault became the first commercial astronaut to fly with a prosthesis. She was not the first astronaut to fly with prosthesis. That was thrown out there a lot simply because NASA does not talk about what they've done with their astronauts. But Haley was chosen as a crew member of Inspiration 4 back in 2021. She had childhood cancer and has a bone prosthetic. I don't know what criteria they used, what criteria SpaceX used to determine whether or not Haley was safe to fly. They flew on a Falcon 9, they flew on a Crew Dragon for almost 3 days, circling the Earth, and then they landed back down. So that's pretty intense. That's not a 6-month stay on the ISS, but that includes launch, microgravity, and re-entry. And I don't know what criteria SpaceX used to certify that she was safe to fly, but it was less than 6 months from her being publicly announced to her flying. She was publicly announced in February and flew in September of 2021. I don't know how long before she was publicly announced she was told about this, but I don't think it was very long. My guess is it was less than 6 months, because they would not have even announced her if they did not already know she was going to fly. Because Jared Isaacman, who funded Inspiration 4, was a paying customer willing to pay a full flight for Inspiration 4, 4 seats, SpaceX made it happen. They didn't take 2 years to do a feasibility study to even determine whether or not someone like Haley could fly. They simply trusted the doctors on the ground to say with some confidence that she was safe to fly, and there were probably waivers involved. And one thing to note, with the rules in place right now, the FAA, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, is restricted from putting laws or guidelines onto spaceflight providers about spaceflight. So the FAA right now is protecting people on the ground, the uninvolved people on the ground, from any kind of spaceflight problem. However, the astronauts on board, the commercial astronauts on board, the spaceflight participants, they are under the regime of informed consent. So all Haley needed to do was sign that she was informed about the risks of spaceflight. And the US government at this point has not allowed the FAA to put additional rules on SpaceX or any other spaceflight providers, which does allow things to go more quickly. Well, I do want to talk about the fact that NASA has actually flown people with prostheses. Because of health privacy protections, NASA does not say that they are flying this astronaut who has undergone this health concern or this surgery or anything like that. So we don't know publicly the names of the people who are tied to these procedures. I do have a list, which I will link below, from a presentation from almost 3 years ago, where NASA was talking about the fact that they have flown astronauts with significant health concerns. The key here is that these were already selected and flown astronauts. So these were veteran astronauts who underwent some kind of health consideration and then flew again. And in that listing, and then this is 3 years old now, but in that listing, they talked about how they had astronauts fly with indwelling bone prosthetic and hip prosthetic, at least 2 of them with hip prosthetic. And again, this might be out of date. So NASA is already certifying that these astronauts can fly. Now, hip replacement, that's not the same thing as a full leg prosthetic. It's not the same kind of disability. We don't know how long these astronauts stayed in space. We also don't know how long it took them to certify these astronauts to fly again. So for all I know, it takes NASA 2 years to do these studies as well. But at least they are looking into it, even if they're not publicly stating so. It might just be that governments take a very long time to do these kinds of things, and the shortcut is the commercial space industry. And Europeans are already figuring this out. ESA flies very few astronauts per year. And so what we're seeing is ESA and non-US astronauts in general turning to the commercial space industry, even just to fly to the ISS. For example, and I apologize because I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Swedish astronaut Marcus Wandt, he was an ESA reserve astronaut, and he flew to the ISS with Axiom Space. That's a private space company. He flew on SpaceX Falcon 9 Dragon to the ISS with Axiom Space on a private mission, AX-3, which flew earlier this year. ESA has already signed an agreement with Axiom to fly a second ESA reserve astronaut, a Polish one. They have not selected which Polish astronaut that will be or when that will happen. ESA's understanding that instead of going through NASA's process, they're kind of shortcutting it by going through Axiom, even though Axiom can only do a maximum of 2 private astronaut missions per year to the ISS. And outside of ESA, Axiom has already flown an Italian government-sponsored astronaut and a Turkish government-sponsored astronaut to the ISS through the same process. And outside of Europe, the Indian Space Agency, ISRO, it has been in talks with NASA about flying 2 of its Indian astronauts to the International Space Station, and it looks like they're setting up an agreement with Axiom Space, maybe for AX-4, to do that. So you can see these astronauts, these European and Asian astronauts, moving through the system faster through a commercial process than through the traditional government process. And it might just be that the future of disabled astronauts, whether they're European or from any country, might just be through commercial space. We have seen the 2 oldest people to fly to space through suborbital commercial spaceflight on Blue Origin. Blue Origin flew first Wally Funk when she was 82 and William Shatner when he was 90. Not the same thing as a disabled astronaut, but you can imagine that there's probably no government entity that would have flown people that old. And there were probably significant health considerations to consider for people in their 80s and 90s to fly to space. Even if it was just suborbital, they still had to go through the launch microgravity and re-entry process, so it was still a lot of strain on their bodies. I also want to point you to an organization called Astro Access. They've been a bit quiet recently, but the past few years they have flown people with disabilities, varying disabilities, deaf, blind, amputees, paraplegic, neurodivergent, like various people with disabilities to parabolic flights. This is all in preparation for how to figure out accommodations to fly people with different types of disabilities into space. And this will be especially important as we transition from government facilities to commercial facilities in space. The commercial space stations that, Axiom Space being one of them, as well as Orbital Reef and Starlab and VAST and others, they are currently designing and building and will soon be launching commercial space stations in low Earth orbit. And it's a lot easier to design space station procedures, flight suits, pressure suits, all of the things that you would need humans to fly to space. It's a lot easier to design them to be inclusive from the start than to retrofit them to be inclusive. So I know that there are people out there, I have a client who's one of them, who are talking to these commercial spaceflight providers and asking them to consider the ways that they are making spaceflight accessible to all now in the design phase, in the procedure creation phase, rather than making it exclusive and leaving a huge portion of the population out. And this, of course, aside from being fair, is also going to be profitable, because the more people that you allow to go to space safely, the more of a customer pool that you have. I know that there are people out there who have the funds to go to space, but are not eligible to be a government astronaut. And instead, if they can fly through a commercial spaceflight provider and it doesn't take them a 2-year feasibility study to even know if they can or not, then imagine what the possibilities might be for these commercial space stations to open it up to different users. Congratulations to John McFall. I really hope to see him manifested on a future ISS flight someday, or if not ISS, a future commercial space station flight.